This session goes until 4 o'clock, which means that we have quite a bit of time for question and discussion. What I'd like to propose is that we take a number of questions from the audience. I would ask you to be succinct in your question, and following that, we'll return to the speakers and ask them to address your questions. And I think in that way we will be able to hear a number of questions and to give the speakers time to respond to them. So, yes, please.
My question.
Just a moment, please.
Thank you. My question is directed to Professor Benjo. I think the subject of great interest. Israel in the past was involved with the northern Iraq Kurds, supporting in many respects. What's the situation today? What is Israel doing anything, and if, what, where, how? Thank you.
Thank you.
In Turkey or in Iraq?
With respect to the Kurds and with the situation between Israel and Turkey, I mean, that makes it even more interesting. What and how?
Okay.
Professor Benjo, I want to ask you two questions. The first question is, what part of Turkey is Kurdish territory? Secondly, how many people, part of the population, is Kurdish? The second question is, how come that the Kurdistan was not created during the Sykes-Picot talks? Thank you.
Yes.
I want to ask a question, Mr. Drorzevi, and I'm representing the state-run Turkish Anatolian Agency, and really interesting your speech. Could you say, and in the Turkey, the deep state has been dismantled and the during of the AKP administration last 10 years? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Question to Professor Barki. How would you describe the influence of the Turkey diaspora, especially in Europe, concerning the economic influence within Turkey? How much do they donate or not donate? Are they trying to influence inner policy with their growing numbers within Europe?
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, there's one in front, please.
I would like to move to a completely different field, and I'm not sure who's going to answer it, and that's the question of culture in Turkey. I assume it's to you, Professor Barki. I was in Istanbul 2 years ago and was struck by the flowering of phenomenal modern art. What's the cultural policy of the AKP?
You were struck by what? By
the flowering of modern art. Completely modern art, a fantastic art museum in Istanbul, and young artists, lots of activity, amazing work, and some of it rooted in Turkey, some of it clearly international. Some people coming back from Germany, other people just have grown up there. So I wondered what the policy of the AKP was towards cultural diversity and encouraging artistic innovation.
Okay, thank you. There's a whole cluster of questions in the back corner.
Take the first one.
No, I think we'll take some more. It gives them time to think about answers.
I guess this question is both for Dr. Bancho and for Dr. Barki. Dr. Barki, you mentioned the Gulen movement, and I think that both of you could probably try to answer this question about differentiations between the Gulen movement's attitudes towards the Kurds and that of the AKP.
I have two questions. First for Dr. Zevin, second for Dr. Barki. The first is whether there was any struggle within the army, because we know that there was a struggle between civil society and the army, or the Kemalist institutions and elected government. So what I wanted to ask is whether there was an internal struggle within parts of the army or generals, because there were differences between them. Professor Barkey, I would like to ask you whether there is an economic clash within the AKP, because from what we can see, there is a conflict between the pro-IMF declared policy of Erdogan, and I think that this is the most disciplined government in Turkey, and the Islamic middle class interests. So I would like to ask you if there is some.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's quite a collection of questions. I'm going to add just one or two of my own briefly, and give you time to think for yet another moment about how you want to address these things. For Henri, I wondered if you could add to the mix of things that you addressed Erdogan's ambition to implement constitutional changes that would put more power in the presidency with a view to becoming the next president of the Turkish Republic, and how you factor that into the way that Erdogan thinks about what is possible and what is not. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. So, Henri, would you like to begin, please?
Sure.
And I would say that at this point you could take, say, 7 minutes each to answer at least, and then we'll see if you want to get back to each other.
The first question was asked about the diaspora. I think the diaspora, look, all diasporas tend to be very nationalist, and the diaspora in Europe is divided in the sense that there's a very strong Turkish element and there's a very strong Kurdish element, and the two obviously don't mix very well in Europe, and each in some ways do different things with respect to Turkey. The Turkish diaspora, to the extent that it has begun to flourish now, constitutes actually an important source of business for Turkish exporters. Whether it is food or it is other kinds of goods, it's a natural liaison in terms of economics. The Kurdish diaspora obviously is one of the major sources of funds for the PKK and for the Kurdish movement. So in a way they're working at cross purposes. But I don't think that there is a huge amount of influence on the part of the diaspora in terms of policy in Turkey. They tend to follow what the government does. All diasporas in some ways tend to do the same thing. The question on culture, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I think the part of the reason why you have such an explosion in art is because Turkey is a much richer country. I mean, its GDP has increased dramatically. People have more money to spend on art, and this is where globalization essentially has finally come to Turkey. And to the extent that there is an AKP policy, there is one in that they have been very tolerant and they have been very supportive of art. Yes, they may not like what some of these modern artists are doing, but on the other hand, Turkey is one of the few places where you hear where the government is trying to build museums. I mean, they also have money to do that. I suspect that part of this is because they want to turn Istanbul into a cultural capital, a transportation hub. I mean, it is part of the global ambition of Turkey. So they're not standing in the way, and they're not, and in many ways they are actually supporting. But I think a lot of it also comes from the fact that it's become much more cosmopolitan. I mean, Turks are finally getting integrated into the global community. And to the extent that this helps Turkey, it is what AKP wants. The Gülen movement and the Kurds. Look, I think this is where you see a serious split within the AKP coalition. And the Gülen movement has been quite, should we say, hard line when it comes to the Kurds. And in fact, only recently, I think Fethullah Gülen made a statement which people really were very puzzled by, and he said that he, I don't know how many years ago, gave the AKP a whole series of suggestions as to how to deal with the Kurdish problem. And one of my close friends was a journalist who managed to track down the story. He said, I cannot confirm it for you, but what he thinks what happened is that the Gulen sent a list of about a few thousand, 10,000 people that the AKP should send to the region as functionaries, as public servants. Of course, they're all Gulenists, and it goes without saying. But the AKP essentially, Erdogan took that list and threw it into the garbage. But there you see a very, the Gulenists are much stricter, and they are the ones who went after the chief of Turkish National Intelligence for talking to the PKK, etc. But there is also a place where the two do work together, and that is in the case against the KCK. This is the case that Ofra indirectly mentioned, where there are 7,000 to 8,000 people who have been in prison. The judges and the prosecutors are working in collusion with judges and prosecutors who are assumed to be close to Gulen are also working very close with the state in order to essentially decimate the BDP and this incipient new Kurdish structure that the PKK is trying to create, the parallel government that the PKK is trying to create in the southeast. The truth is the KCK is a very interesting and very a challenge to the state, because what the PKK is trying to do is create a civilian infrastructure that will one day rule the southeast. But the way by which the government and Gulen are going after it is, if there's of the 8,000, if there's 1,000 people who are really members of the KCK, they're also bringing in everybody else in order to intimidate, in order to harass, in order to undermine. So there is some collusion, but there is also some difference. And in terms of whether there is a clash within the AKP between pro-IMF and I would say no. I mean, both sides, everybody are on the same. The Islamic bourgeoisie is not against what the AKP is doing. On the contrary, they want the kind of policy to continue. Amy's question on the ambitions. Let me just finish with that. Erdogan wants to become president. He has promised that he will step down from the prime ministership because he put himself essentially term limits. He wanted to make Turkey a semi-presidential system out of the French way. It's not going to work. There's a great deal of opposition within the party, but also within the public to changing the system. They don't want a presidential system. So he's in a real bind, and everything that he's doing now, including going after the Kurds, is an attempt by him to create a coalition that is centered within the nationalist camp, including the MHP, in order to change the constitution. I don't think it's going to work. But the compromise will be that they will change the constitution. The constitution has a clause that says that the person who becomes president has to be above party. In other words, cannot belong to a political party, cannot lead a political party. What they will probably do is change that clause. So Erdogan will become president. He won't have the greater powers that his French style constitution would give, but in practical purposes, because he will be elected directly by the people, which means that he will have to have at least 50% of the votes, and clearly he's going to get a lot more than 50%. He's going to have enormous amount of power as a political leader, somebody who belongs to the party, and he's going to control his political party from the presidency, even though the prime minister has more executive power. So you will have essentially Erdogan running the country, and this is, by the way, one reason why you're not going to see a Putin-Medvedev situation in Turkey, where Gül becomes the prime minister. That's not going to work. He's going to find somebody who's going to be more compliant, and Gül would not accept a secondary position like that anyway.
Thank you very much. Dora?
Yes, I'd like to refer to two of the questions that weren't addressed to me, but I think they're interesting. One is about the culture and the art. And I agree with Henri's description, but I think, first of all, it's driven by the economy. The economy is paramount for the AKP, and this brings money, this brings tourists, this brings more to the state in various ways. But I think there's also some kind, well, the AKP is a big party. You can't really talk about the AKP's attitude to art. But if you look at Erdogan, I think there is some kind of a benign disdain of art. And you see it in the famous case of the great statue of Kars. I don't know if you've heard about this thing. A very well-known Turkish artist erected a statue in the city of Kars near the Armenian border, which was very tall, about 10 meters tall. I think it was very pretty. But Erdogan described it as a monster and ujube, and ordered the town to dismantle it, or basically told them to dismantle. They took out the statue. It may have been because it was taller than the mosques in the city, I don't know, but it's clear that his attitude is not really driven by a great appreciation of art. As to the question of the presidential system, I think that's also a very interesting question, and indeed there is a lot of opposition in the party and outside the party to the idea that the system will be changed from a parliamentary system, which Turkey has been having for some 80 years now, and change into a presidential system. It's very difficult to do, but we should also bear in mind that after the 1980 coup, the president in the constitution was given great powers. So this is when Kenan Evren was made president, the chief of staff. He was given enormous powers as president, and they're still there in the constitution. So in a sense, you could say that Erdogan could be president according to the current law and still exercise a lot of power in the state. I don't know if you agree, but it'll be interesting to discuss this point. Now, to the question that I was asked. First of all, has the deep state been dismantled? Well, that's the question, of course. Has it been dismantled? Yeah. I would say that as far as a foreign force dealing with internal Turkish politics, I don't think there was a deep state to start with. I don't think there was any nefarious USA policy or NATO policy or some other big international policy aimed at changing Turkey's internal politics. And in that sense, it wasn't dismantled because it wasn't there. It was dismantled, the part of it that was direct or played by the army, by some of the secular politicians, by some of the power wielders in the state, was there, I think was dismantled by AKP very effectively by Erdogan. But now it seems that another one is rising in its place. Erdogan himself is creating his own secret mechanisms for influencing politics, for intimidating rivals on the political stage. So I think it's coming back in some way as an internal force in Turkey. Finally, about whether there was a struggle in the army. Again, that's one of the problems we're having with Turkey. In Israel, as you know, every general has his own couple of journalists following him and fighting his battles. Ashkenazi has some, and Ehud Barak has some, and others have some. And we know about these power plays within the army. Sometimes we know more, sometimes we know less, but we know a lot about them. In Turkey, at least as far as the public is concerned, the army is above the fray. I have no doubt that there are struggles within the army. I have no doubt that some of the generals supported removing the AKP government and others opposed it. But we don't know much about this. And this is exactly one of my points, that there is no serious investigative journalism, whether it's intimidated by the state or whether it's because it just doesn't exist. But we don't know. We don't know the true stories of what went on in the army in 2003, 2004, 2007. Thank you.
I'd like to just add two small points on these issues before we turn to Ofer's response to the many questions that were addressed to her. And it's this briefly. First of all, as regards the Derin Devlet, the deep state, this isn't something that was invented during the Republican era. It's a tradition that existed under Abdul Hamid, and so it was deeply rooted in the culture of Turkish politics before there was a Turkish politics. It was an inherent part of the way the Committee of Union and Progress operated as an underground movement leading up to the Young Turk Rebellion, and it continued to be a modus operandi of the CUP once they were in power, even as the government of the ending years of the Ottoman Empire. So that it isn't particularly surprising that this is seen as a possibility of the many possibilities for operating politically in Turkey, nor that it's not looked on as a kind of aberration necessarily by people in power. So I think that those are some things that we can also keep in mind when we think about what this is about. And so it's not surprising to me at all that Erdogan should have assumed that this was part of his tool chest, in a sense, as the political leader of Turkey. And the other point I wanted to make is about art and contemporary and in contemporary Turkey, and that is that I think that the flourishing of art that you pointed out is part of a much broader flourishing of culture in its broadest sense, and I would include in that education, all of the arts, the plastic arts, the performing arts. And I think that one of the really interesting things in Turkey is that the new wealth in Turkey, the private wealth, plays an extraordinary role in promoting arts and culture. Building private universities, funding them, funding museums, funding private foundations that support culture. It's something that we don't necessarily see at first glance in visiting Turkey, but I think that it's important to note that the green capital, but also much of the capital that was built up in Turkey from the point when there was capital available in the Turkish Republic has gone to sustaining those kinds of things. Private philanthropy is alive and well in Turkey, and it's a very, very important part of Turkish culture. So those are just two brief comments. Ofra, please.
Yeah. And you didn't ask me about the journalists, but if you remember that there are 100 journalists in prison, so maybe you have your answer why they are not investigated. They will be investigated if they are. Now to the questions about Israel and the Kurds. Of course, I don't know anything about this, not in anywhere, but I might guess regards the Israel's position regarding the Kurds of Turkey. Israel also has differentiated between good Kurds and bad Kurds throughout our history. The good Kurds were the Kurds of Iraq, and the bad Kurds were the Kurds of Turkey, because we were allied with Turkey. And I think the line has remained the same up to date, where Israel prefers to do business with Turkey rather than support or be in any relationship with the Kurds of Turkey, believing, hoping that one time we can manage our relationship between an important strategic partner in the region. And maybe this is a good idea, I don't know. But in any case, I think if we have to, we do not need to build our relationship with Turkey at the expense of the Kurds in one way or another. This is my private opinion. The other point is what is the number of the Kurds? Yeah, was this? Where are they? They are in southeastern.
How much part of the territory is Kurdish?
This is a very difficult question, you know, because the Kurds are now spread all over Turkey. You have in Istanbul maybe the greatest mayorship where the Kurds are staying. They are, you know, since they were spread in different times, so you cannot, are you going to include Istanbul or not? Are you going to include Ankara or not? So this is a very difficult question, and this also ties with the other question of numbers of Kurds. The problem with the numbers of Kurds, there are many problems, but first of all, the government would not allow, publishing anything neither in Turkey nor in Syria nor in other places. The other point is the, mixed marriages. Is he a Kurd when he is married with a Turk or not? The other problem is there are Kurds and there are Alevi Kurds who do not consider themselves, some of them do not consider themselves Kurd, there are Zaza Kurds. So this is a very complicated issue to know the numbers, and I think the numbers are not important in a way, because the important thing is if there is any national movement or not, and in my opinion there is. And usually, I mean, the numbers are, if we take all the Kurds all over, maybe 30 million, which is quite a lot. Much more than the Palestinians here who claim to have a state, but they do not, the Kurds. So in a way, you have here a very big majority, as you want to call it, who is claiming something different than what they have had up till now in all these countries. But both parties exaggerate. The Kurds would say they are 45 million. The others, the states would say, only 15, 20. So that's why numbers are not going to lead us anyway. About Gulen and the Kurds, I'm not sure that I will agree with you 100%. About the Gulens, because the Gulens, their source is really, their root is also Sufi, and in a way there is a kind of like-mindedness with the Kurds, maybe more than the AKP, which is strictly, Islamist. I'm debating with you. I don't know. I mean, maybe there were a kind of, different views, but to remember that they came from the same source, from the Sufi source, and that they are much more liberal than the AKP in a way. They wanted to open schools, etc. They are trying to attract the Western world more than the AKP in many ways, in the States, in other places, even in Israel, they are trying to do things. So I'm just wondering if you would think it over at this point, which is very, very important to try and...
All I would say to that is that when you look at the reaction of the Kurds in the southeast to Gulen, they become very hostile. When you talk to BDP officials and look at the PKK is actually targeting Gulenist schools.
But why? This is the point.
Right,
why?
Gulen, I mean, because they think that the Gulenists are actually very nationalist, Turkish nationalists, which is true. And that the Gulen attempt is to assimilate rather than recognize a separate Kurdish entity. It is, in a way, Islam versus nationalism to some extent. Gulen is pushing a much more of a religious approach, whereas the Kurds, at least the nationalist Kurds, are talking about nationhood, they're talking about autonomy, they're talking about political issues, and they don't want to hear about Islam. But here there's enormous amount of tension.
But the AKP, what's the difference between the AKP and the Gulen? Because the AKP are building these mosques, and trying to send preachers, Turkish preachers who would preach to them in Turkish, while the Kurds want to be preached in Kurdish. So this is the government is doing, the AKP is doing.
True. I mean, I didn't say that AKP and Gulen are completely at odds. Where they're at odds is in terms of the judicial system, in terms of talking to the PKK. Remember when the prosecutors decided to, they called in the chief of the Turkish National Intelligence, and they tried to, not only him and his deputies, etc. It was a brazen attempt by the Gulenists to contain what they thought was AKP's too accommodationist policy. I mean, I would say, there is a confluence, let's say 70% of the way between AKP and Gulen, but there's also a 30% of divergence between AKP and Gulen. I mean, it's not...
Okay, so that's it. These are all my questions. Or were there any...
There was a question about why after World War I,
They tried to. I mean, the Sevres, do you want now to revive Sevres Treaty? I don't want to revive it. Sevres Treaty actually wanted to allow for a...
Why I'm asking is because when Iraq was created, when Faisal were thrown out from Syria, Great Britain created Iraq. And
Yes.
to give them some wealth, they took off Turkey, Mosul, and Kirkuk. This is pure Kurdish territory. What is the reason? There is something behind.
Actually, at the beginning, the British wanted to make an independent Kurdish area, at least in Iraq, but also part of Turkey. But when, the things changed during the war itself, during the independence war of Turkey, when they, managed to kick out all the enemies, and they had to change all the treaties. I mean, the Sevres Treaty was not ever, how should I say, made true. But then the other treaty of 1923 just put it off.
But the border was already made at that time.
Yeah, the British changed their mind because, there were different forces in the British government itself, among those who were on the ground in Iraq itself and in Britain, where some, for example, Noel or other Edmonds wanted to have this area under the British Kurdish control, but others pulled, especially those who wanted to make, bargaining with King Faisal. King Faisal was just, demanding to have this part. As he said, the Kurdistan is like the head of the whole of Iraq, so he wanted to have the head within Iraq, and he pressurized the British government to give it to make it part of the Iraqi state.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Well, thank you all for your questions. Thank you very much for a fascinating view of Turkey today and of the AKP. I believe there's now a coffee break